Joining. We are going to hold for just a moment while we get everyone in here and make sure we're up and running on our various social media platforms, and we'll get started in just a second.
Julie, you can't do that now. Please don't.
Hey everybody, this is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. We're so thrilled to have you here joining us for our continuing virtual author event series, which we have been doing for a little bit over 14 months now. And we've done about 150 plus of these virtual talks, and we've talked to all kinds of different people. And it's been a really great way to stay connected with all of you and have a tether to our audience in kind of a strange time. But I'm really excited about easing back into some in-person events, which we will be doing this summer. So stay tuned for some info on that. And if you want to see about all the different programs and events that we have coming up, go to our website, magiccitybooks.com. A lot of great stuff coming. One of note specifically is Adam Serwer from The Atlantic and Ta-Nehisi Coates will be doing an event with us on July 7th for a new book about Donald Trump's America called The Cruelty is the Point. So that should be a really fascinating one. So go to our website on that. And you can see more coming on that. I will note tonight we are going to be recording this program for our friends at C-SPAN on Book TV. So if you have questions tonight, please drop those into our Q&A and we'll try to get to some of those. But let's get to the task at hand. I'm really excited. I've gotten to interview a lot of amazing people over the last 12 years. And it's always a little bit intimidating when you interview an interviewer. You know, I've interviewed Rachel Maddow and Don Lemon and a lot of pretty amazing journalists, but I will say I was a little bit nervous to interview Mr. Chris Matthews of Hardball fame, and someone who I've been kind of following and watching for many years. And kind of, I think when I was certainly in my younger days, kind of trying to figure out what I thought about things, was certainly someone who had a big impact on me thinking more critically about the country in which I live. And I was really thrilled to see this wonderful new book, This Country. Chris has written many books, but I think in some ways this is the most personal book that he's written. And I thought it was a really interesting insight into a pretty amazing life. So welcome, Chris Matthews, virtually to Tulsa. We won't embarrass you too much by saying you told us this is the only state you have never been to. And I don't know if this actually counts, but we're going to give you like a half credit for it. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. But welcome.
Thanks, Jeff.
Congratulations on the book. I was trying to think when I first heard about the book, how you would actually contain all the things you've done without giving us kind of a Churchillian multi-volume set of memoir. And also, just to be candid with, you're known for kind of a shaggy dog story and stretching things out a little bit. So I was thrilled that you were able to kind of get all of this into this tight package.
Well, I owe that to Stuart Roberts, the editor at Simon & Schuster. And he didn't change anything. Those are my words verbatim, but he did take me from 140,000 words, which is a pretty big book, down to 93,000. So he did things like, he always said, everything has to end towards the jobs you got, which is the opportunities you got, and how it one thing led to another. It can't be having digressions, and so nothing about girlfriends in grade school, nothing like that, nothing about 10 chapters on Africa, went down to 2 chapters, and I think he was pushing me for 1. I couldn't get any close. I wanted to have at least 2 on my 2 years in Africa. But if you ever meet anybody from the Peace Corps, they'll tell you that their 2 years plus over wherever they were was a much more out of size or out of proportion part of their life. It just is. It's just so many things happen that will never happen again. It's so unique an experience that you remember almost everything from it. And the best editor is memory. And if I say to people who think about writing anything, I say, if you can remember, it's memorable by definition. So think about why you remember it. And so you're right. It was it could have been a 3-volume. In fact, I think when you think about 47,000 words, that's almost a book. Out of this thing. But I think the editor was right about his sharp and somewhat ruthless attempt to reduce me to book size.
I think when I think about your career and everything that you've done, I mean, it's hard. You're inextricably linked to the boomer experience. I mean, you were born at the end of 1945, right at the beginning of that period, and your experiences, whether with the Peace Corps, your connection to John F. Kennedy's life, your connection to, the Carter administration, all the work you did pre-television and all the journalism that you've done is kind of, when you see like a film like Forrest Gump, for example, it like hits all these cultural touchstones.
Thank you for that reference point, but I agree. Or Zelig, it's
very much like that.
It's like I was photoshopped. Like, what am I doing there with George Herbert Walker Bush at dinner one night? What am I doing with Obama? What am I doing with Trump? What am I doing with all these people? Jimmy Carter, John McCain.
What that says to me is that this inherent curiosity that you've had your whole life, and interest in kind of a general idea of America, you've kind of ended up in that kind of Zelig-like position.
It's always I remember my first merit badge, my first citizenship merit badge was citizenship in the nation. I mean, I didn't really get focused on local politics much, mayor's races, city council. It's always about the role of the United States in the world, the Cold War and how we deal with that challenge, or how the federal government affects our lives. How much freedom do we have, and how do we protect it? How do we balance off social legislation with freedom, independence, and personal independence? And I think that's always going to be the issue that interests me: socialism versus capitalism, individual rights versus social responsibilities, that kind of thing. It's always, to me, the fascinating question. As you know, through the book, I'm keep asking. I spent a summer in Worcester, Massachusetts at the library, basically trying to figure out what's the natural order of things. Talk about a primitive question. Is it socialism, or is it free enterprise, as we call it, capitalism? And my my conclusion after my study was socialism if it looks out for everybody, if it's actually fair. It isn't run by a highfalutin Politburo that grabs everything and claims they're good socialist masters, when in fact they're just looking out for themselves. So if it looks, and then I got to go to East Germany as the wall was coming down, into Budapest, and to see in Hungary in that fateful year of 1989, that I was right in my conclusions that if you screw the people, if you give them second-rate currency, you don't let them go to the hotels, you give them cars that don't work, you grab the bennies, the good life for the top people, those people are going to be embittered, and they're going to be glad that wall came down, and I think I was right about my conclusion.
So I'm curious, you've always struck me as kind of very pragmatic in a certain sense, but you always have a sense of optimism, but that sense of optimism is tied back to, I think, a certain couple of moments in your life early on that kind of, I think, exemplified to you what America could be in certain times. And my question is always this, we have Elizabeth Warren is from Oklahoma, so she's one of our great exports here. And she always is talking about this return to the kind of mid-century middle class period. And I always wonder, when you look at the great arc of American culture, that period, that post-war boom where there really was kind of a thriving middle class, only really lasted for 20, 30 years before it began to decline in the Reagan era. And my question is, do you think that inequality is the natural default in some ways of the American system, and that was a blip on our radar, or is that something we actually can return to?
I remember hearing this story that Jim Fowles, the great reporter, an essayist, asked Jimmy Carter, how do you reconcile freedom with equality? Which are the great poles in life. I mean, if you have total equality, you don't have much freedom, because the government's basically guaranteeing everybody gets the same results. And if you have total freedom, you probably don't have much equality. So I do think that Senator Warren's on to something. I got to it from a different direction. I have a different experience. All these equity billionaires, do they do anything? Do they make anything? And I look at American history, and there's sort of a natural social resentment of people that make money off money, even though everybody wants a good deal when they retire with their money. I mean, in all fairness, everybody wants to make money off money, no matter how small time they are. They want interest at the bank, which used to be you used to have the savings book and got 3 or 4%. Now you get nothing. But I wonder whether the equity people who make a fortune buying and selling and going to the chop shop or whatever with these companies that they didn't start, that they're able to glean the real profit out of it. So the entrepreneur at the beginning didn't really get the money. He sold the company to a big equity company, and they're making the profits off it. I wonder whether we've separated not just product from labor, which is a concern I think that Warren has, that labor isn't being paid for its wealth that's created, but maybe the entrepreneurial contribution to production has been robbed from the entrepreneur and grabbed by the equity person. Because you got to explain to me why people are making billions of dollars in the equity world. What are they doing, and who are they taking it from? It is zero sum. Where did that money come from? All that money in equity. I do worry about that. And I think the ratios are off. I do think our market system works as it has with Pfizer, with the COVID vaccinations without government help, and also with partnership in the case of Moderna. Partnership works as well. I do think that the worst case dictators in the world come to the United States to stay alive when they're sick. They all come here. The Shah, everybody comes here. We have the most amazing advanced medicine, not the most well distributed by any means. It's not fair, but it is excellent at the top. So the market achieved certain goals. I think I had lunch with Elizabeth a couple of years ago, Senator Warren, and she said, I'm a capitalist. I believe in capitalism. So it's not like she's an all-out attacker of the principle of profit, but I think it's the ratios of what the working stiff, if you will. And what does explain why someone in Erie, Pennsylvania, or Wilkesboro, Pennsylvania, or Oklahoma feels this resentment towards liberals? It's because they feel they're not providing for them the way that the FDR crowd did, or Harry Truman did, or Jack Kennedy did. They're not labor people. They don't seem like labor union types. They're not walking around saying shoulder to shoulder with labor like Fritz Mondale used to do. They seem to be more with academics and suburbanites with some wealth, the better off suburbs. That's where the Democratic Party has been seeking votes. That's where they get the votes against Trump. But they have never really, since Reagan, been able to grab the working class. My answer is she's onto something. I'm not sure I agree with the way she goes after it. We all have our different styles. But sometimes when you criticize, it doesn't work. You call someone a racist, as Jimmy Carter said, you will never get that person's vote again. They're gone. So it doesn't, like preaching to the chorus. Well, the opposite of preaching to the chorus is attacking the other side. And they're both useless politically. What you have to do is find a way to reach the middle politically. And I think Trump, in his devilish genius, figured out some things that the Republicans had wrong before he came along, which is, unlike the Republicans from Jerry Ford on, he doesn't attack entitlement programs. It's a cheap shot. He's never taken it. I'm not building Trump's case here. I think he's terrible. I think he's a traitor in terms of not denying the results of the 2020 election. But look, the first Republican presidential candidate to come along and say, I'm leaving Social Security the way it is. You get your benefits, all right? Number two, you're going to get your Medicare. And three, if you've got, basically, without saying so, if you've got Alzheimer's or dementia in the family, you're going to get Medicaid too. You're going to get it all. And what I'm also going to do for you, besides making sure I don't mess with any of the programs you work for your whole life, I'm going to make sure that your kids will have a job close enough to home that they'll visit you once in a while. So we're going to fight the Chinese. We're going to go into tough trade wars, because he knows that people all blame it on the foreign cultures. They say, oh yeah, they're underselling their labor. They can always outsell us when it comes to labor. And they're taking all our jobs away from our kids that would naturally be working a half hour, an hour from here. They're working in the Silicon Valley. They're working in New York, or they're working somewhere in Connecticut. They're not working near here. And Trump basically promised, I'm going to fight to get those jobs back by going to war with the Chinese. Now, he didn't succeed, but he knew that the American working people are not British Labour Party people. They're not lefties. They're not deeply resentful of wealth. They're not like that. They're about, all I want is what I need. That's the attitude of most working people in the country. I dare to speak for them, but the voting suggests they just want what they need.
Yeah, and to that point, just to kind of carry that on, one thing that Trump also did was he kind of took the wind out of the sails of the kind of hawkish side of the Republican Party, where he's talking about stupid wars and things like that that would be verboten just 5 years previously for that side.
And the neocons were wrong, and they were wrong for all kinds of reasons. I didn't think the Iraq War had anything to do with what they called WMD. In fact, they called it WMD so they didn't have to say nuclear, but they could suggest nuclear. a mushroom cloud will be the smoking gun. So it was a very clever campaign to get us into a war we had no reason to fight. And it certainly doesn't help Israel, our allies over there. It didn't help them at all. So I'm not sure what exactly it accomplished positively, except it cost 4,000 to 5,000 American lives, perhaps up to 200,000 Iraqi lives, because we walked in there and said, if you don't do what we tell you to do, we're going to kill you. That's what we said. We've never done that in history, I don't think. We went into another country and said, who never attacked us, and say, if you don't get out of our way and obey us, because we're coming in as conquerors, we're going to kill you. And that's what we did. It's an awful American period. I mean, we were always growing up, you're talking about my period of growing up. We thought the aggressor was the bad guy, and we were the aggressor. And thank God Trump, in his crude study of American working class people, said, I think they'll get this, that they were used.
You know, people were talking about books, you know, the whole last 4 or 5 years, people were trying to look to different books and things to explain where we were. And one of the books that got talked about a lot was Sinclair Lewis's book, It Can't Happen Here. And but the book that I kept going back to was All the President's Men, or All the King's Men rather, and Robert Penn Warren's novel about Huey Long. And looking at those two characters together, I think, you know, we don't look at that populism. You look at Huey and some of those characters, you look at Donald Trump. I didn't see that parallel being drawn as much as you would think. And I wonder if that's because we forget our history too quickly. You know, do people now in 2021 understand what was happening in Louisiana back, you know, at that time period, who he was, what was happening with that level of kind of democratic populism, and how it's very parallel to now? Because you talk about the value of history.
Sure. Well, that's in that image of the stranger coming into town, a la Nashville, the guy driving around the long car, very, very forbidding presence, menacing presence. What was he up to? You think of Tennessee Ernie Ford, who used to have a TV show, and the character based on Andy Griffith played him in a Face in the Crowd, Suzanne movie.
Yeah.
And you think about how we do have that figure that comes in and promises everything, a demagogue. Broderick Crawford was fabulous in the movie, All the King's Men, fabulous portrayal. And that role, ironically, in our culture, I wrote a book with a chapter about this. We also had a figure, the reverse of that, the outsider who comes in and saves us in a way we could never save ourselves. John Wayne.
Pied Piper, yeah.
No, but really sterner stuff. John Wayne in The Searchers, where he comes in, a guy who's basically, or Shane. They're basically dark dressed guys. They're dressed like bad guys, and they're stern and they're no fun, but they get the bad guy and he saved Natalie Wood from the Indians, from the Native Americans. I mean, and Shane came in and fought the worst cowboy bunch you'd ever seen, the ranchers, and helped the homesteaders. The homesteaders wouldn't have been able to do without him. And they were courageous.
The idea of the anti-hero was born and all that with that.
But a good guy, a guy who comes in like almost like a savior, a religious figure. And why is that we figure that we can't do it ourselves, if you will? The community can't do it. How about High Noon? The March was standing alone when the community let him down. We don't have this notion that even if Mr. Smith goes to Washington, it's not the public that saves Mr. Smith, Jefferson Smith. It's the bad guy, played by Claude Rains, who comes out and says everything he says is true. That was the verdict came from the bad guy. Isn't that interesting? Well, we don't Capra doesn't have faith in the masses, but he has faith in maybe the bad guy to turn. I mean, if you go through all the George Stephen movies, from Shane, Place in the Sun, Gunga Din, all the great epic films he made, inevitably about 4/5 of the way through the movie, the bad guy does something incredibly good. And you go, wow, life is complicated. You know, the thuggy leader, Kali worshiper in Gunga Din ends up dumping into the snake pit so he can't be used as a hostage. You know, Chris Calloway, the Ben Johnson character in Shane, he shows up and says, I'm getting out of here. The deck is stacked against you, Shane. I'm leaving. It just grabs you. And Elizabeth Taylor showing up on death row to meet Montgomery Clift in Place in the Sun, this society girl that you think is so cosseted, so treated too well her whole life, and yet she's got the guts to go to the prison and say, this guy will love you forever. I mean, I'm taken with it because it shows incredible courage, from somebody you didn't expect it from.
Yeah, I mean, it very much operates in the gray. You know, you mentioned all those Westerns and how that kind of that dynamic existed. It very much exists now. You know, look at what's dominating popular culture is superhero media, which is still the same idea that the world has all these fault problems. It's this apocalyptic situation, but there has to be these certain individuals who are super and have talents and skills, you know, that are otherworldly to save all of the rest of us.
Isn't that right? And it's like I have a grandson here. He's a Godzilla freak. I mean, he loves Godzilla versus King Kong. I always like, who's the good guy? But even movies like the Taken movies, Liam Neeson, this guy, I have certain skills. Remember the great line? Yeah. I mean, everybody loves that line. I like to think of a guy that can do anything against the bad guys. Like, be careful, bad guy. I've got certain skills, you know. Yeah,
I mean, the vigilante spirit is inextricably linked to the American spirit in a way, I guess, because we were rebels from the get-go, I guess, in a certain sense.
We want our own car. We don't want to ride a bus. We want to have our own house. We don't want to live in an apartment. We don't want to get on a train. We want to take the car. Everything's about cowboy spirit. We want a gun. We want our own doctor. He goes to church with us. We want our doctor. We don't want their doctor. We want our doctor. It's so much of that individual cowboyism.
Yeah, you can see that playing out in you know the struggle to hit vaccine issue, all that kind of bootstrap mentality. Well, I want to get back to the book for a second, which is I loved the parts about you. You know, you've written so many books, and I guess the first question I would ask is, why did it take this long to write this book?
Well, I'm at the end of the line. I guess I'm 75. You know, I'm not going to do many more of these incredible episodes like being in Berlin when the wall's coming down, or in South Africa with Archbishop Tutu, or Belfast, or in the back room for half dozen years with Tip O'Neill, just with him and me and two other guys, Ari Weiss and Kirk O'Donnell. And or being on the Air Force One or Marine One with Jimmy Carter. I mean, I didn't think I'd get to do this magical mystery tour of life. And yet I did. And I wanted to I'd always wanted to do it. I signed up for this, I guess in 19 with Simon & Schuster. I wrote one Saturday morning, I got up and knocked it out, a proposal to Jonathan Karp, the publisher. And he liked it right away. And I just, sometimes you struggle when you're writing, and sometimes you just knock it out. It's not predictable, as you probably know. It's unpredictable when you can write beautifully and fast, and other times you struggle. And this time I knocked it out. And then on the way back from, my wife and I went to New Zealand for vacation one Christmas. And on the way back, I had like 12, 13 hours. And I just got a book somewhere to some bookstore, and I got a blank book, and I just started writing it, outlining it. And but it took 1 year to do half the book, and the other year, 2020, to do the other half. Yeah. It was a struggle.
Do you miss being on TV every day?
No. Well, I didn't like leaving. Was the way I left. I left because I commented about a woman's appearance in the makeup room in the next makeup chair, and obviously I had to admit to it. I wasn't going to deny it. Mm-hmm. I said it pretty loud, so it wasn't like I was a secret. It wasn't sotto voce or anything. Mm. And I talked to my boss the next day. My wife and I talked to him, and I said, you know, I don't really want to let NBC decide how to deal with this, whether they're going to suspend me for 6 months. I don't know what they're going to do. I just said, I'm going to make my decision. I'm leaving, and I don't want to stretch this out. So I didn't like it, but it was true. And I think people know I'm honest, and I want to stay that way. I want to stay honest.
Well, and that's what comes through the books, you know, and I think I've always appreciated about you, you know, even if there's something that I disagreed with you on when I was watching you, is you always seemed genuine to me. And the person that you paint a picture of, even like in Catholic school, when you're getting in trouble for talking too much and getting reprimanded for just, I mean, that's you now. I mean, it's very much the same. I mean, has it been difficult because you've had so much success to remain yourself? Did you have periods throughout your life where you kind of got too big of a head, or you had
I think that's a good line. I think too full of yourself.
Yeah.
You know, I did have something. It's not related to leave or anything, I don't think, but it is in a weird way. I've had these jobs that made me well known, and I was all my life since I was in the Peace Corps, was public record. I mean, I've always been sort of exposed, if not a target. And controversial because I've taken positions, and it always causes trouble. But I sort of said to myself, I'm never going to be a celebrity. And you know, when I said to myself that, when I lost my first job. I was a Senate legislative assistant, and I thought it was such a big deal. I thought I was a big deal. And a new AA, a new boss came in, and I was pushed out and had to fight my way back up again. And I said to myself that I will never again think of myself as a celebrity. I'm just not going to let that feeling of walking through a public space with your gaze at a middle distance. You know how Jeff, it works, how celebrities act.
Sure.
They walk a certain way, like they know they're being looked at, and they walk with this sort of big stuff attitude. And they walk around like this. Oh yeah, I'm looking. I know you're looking at me, but I'm not looking back. I have absolutely repelled that from my being from the beginning. So luckily, when I lost the show, I was all ready for this. I was ready to be normal again. But I don't miss not seeing a sundown during the week for 26 years. I never saw the sun go down. I was always on the television, always on TV. You're always aware you're on that night. You know, you're always up for it, and but I do like the affection people have for me, and I see it now that we're opening up everything. Now people walk up to me, or people give me some nice eye contact and say, "I miss you." And I love it. They used to say, my husband loved you, watched it till the end. Really nice people whose whole, I'm company. I know I'm not just a reporter or an analyst or a commentator. For a lot of people, when you watch somebody 5 hours a week, like Rachel's company for people.
Yeah.
And people feel they're with somebody. Johnny Carson used to be my company when I come home from school and I didn't have anything to do. Here's Johnny Carson. He may have been not a nice guy, which you hear he wasn't, but to us on watching the tube, us nobodies, he was our party. He made you feel welcome. So
Yeah.
I know that affectionate part. And people tell me I like it. You don't let them get away with anything. We're basically their champion. Our job is to ask the question they want to ask. And a lot of people don't do. But I think it's our job to work for the audience. That's my last speech on that regard. That is a speech. I just gave one.
No, I mean, that's what you're best at. I think, I was curious though, aside from what you said about how and what the circumstances of you leaving were, does any part of you kind of miss, there has been so much going on the past year.
I don't miss COVID. I do miss, Jeff, you know what I care about. You can tell by just reading my book.
Yeah.
I love election night. And what I used to like about it was, and we didn't get it this time, was an honest concession speech. Yeah. Because in every race, there's a winner and at least one loser, at least one. And that man or woman has to stand before everybody that knows her or him and tell them, I lost. The other person won. And that's democracy. And if you don't have that in your soul, you should never run for office, because you know that the likelihood is you'll end up having to lose. Some great senators served for 24 years, and then they were kicked out. It's 18 years by Frank Moss from Utah. You're gone. Thank you. And you got to be able to do that with tears in your eyes, or after you've cried. I think when most of the time you cry, then come out. But to be personally rejected by the majority of the people that know you, it's tough business. Trump denied us all that. I mean, I mean, Hillary Clinton had to go into Pennsylvania hotel the next day after a shocking upset and face the country with her husband behind and tell everybody in the world she lost. Al Gore, they both got more votes than the other guy, and they had to announce they'd lost. Trump won't do that. I think it's treasonous. I'm sorry.
What's the best concession speech? John McCain's 08 concession speech gets a lot of notice. What's the best one you've ever heard?
Well, I guess the one that Rick Hertzberg, my boss, always says when I was a speechwriter, we always said Adlai Stevenson, because I went and looked it up again today. Stevenson said he was like the little boy that stubbed his toe, who said, I'm too old to cry, but it hurts too much to laugh. And but I think Al Gore's was pretty darn good, because Al Gore only lost by a point, electoral vote, basically. W got it with the help of the Republican Supreme Court, got 271. Okay, that's how he won. And Gore believed, I'm sure, that he could well have won a recount in Florida. He lost, of course, Tennessee. It's his fault. He lost New Hampshire. He could have won those. He didn't run a good campaign like the other guy. I think he said his speech had a certain cadence to it, like Lincoln's second inaugural, which is the best speech, I think, along with Dr. King's I Have a Dream. But Lincoln had to explain to the American people the Civil War that cost already 600,000 lives, dead people, shooting at each other, point blank range, shooting at each other with the same Christian religion in most cases. people that were almost related and shooting to kill this guy across this the field from him. A horrible thing when you think about it, just horrible. And he had to explain that to the American people. Why has this come? And then he has a wonderful phrase. We argued about it, we've discussed it, and then the war came. The way he said that, and then the war came. Until that everything that was suffered at the last would be paid for by the sword. The death of all of our people, white people, was going to be penance for all those centuries of slavery, and with the whip and using people's daughters and selling their wives, and that had to be paid for. And I think that speech was the greatest. And what Gore did was taking that, but then the vote came, or then it was like he said that sort of with fatality. It was a wonderful way of saying, okay, neither one of us wanted this recount thing, but then we had it, and now we have a final solution. It's over. And I thought he was wonderful with that. And Al Gore has always had a problem with, before he wrote The Inconvenient Truth, of really presenting himself in a way that was likable. And I thought that night he did. He found a way of being Al Gore at his best. So they matter to me. I remember Averell Harriman, the governor of New York, and my dad were down the basement watching that in 1958. He got beaten by Nelson Rockefeller. And my dad, who was at work and regular middle-class guy, saying he felt so for this guy, even though he's one of the richest men in the world, because Averell Harriman was going down to defeat. I remember Ed Brooke in Massachusetts, African-American, I think the first elected up north to the Senate, first African-American. And Ed Brooke was so majestic. He talked about, I didn't cry on the mountain, I won't cry in the valley. And he just was unbelievable. It was so good. So I do think there's some magic in it. And Hillary just laid it on the line, and she had to pick that, get it into her head overnight. In the darkness of night, she had to accept the fact she lost. It's about 9 o'clock Eastern time. It was clear she had lost. And Rachel and us were doing it, we're covering it, and everybody's shocked. And I'm sure there were people scrambling around her, Robbie Mook and the others, trying to explain what had happened. I don't know how you explain that to her, because
I think we're still trying to figure that. We're still trying to figure out what happened, I think.
Yeah, but she took it, and it took majesty. Her husband was standing behind her. I was watching it. Bill was crying. Yeah. About first wife.
Yeah.
But Trump won't give us that. He won't give us the truth.
I'm curious, you were one of the few people on your network that that interviewed Trump around that time. I remember you interviewing him, and you guys had known each other for a while before the.
We've been trying to get him onto our show for 10 years. Yeah. And he was always playing a game with me till finally the game being, I'm going to run for president. And his assistant was very loyal, kept saying, oh no, Trump's going to run. Mr. Trump's going to run. He's going to run. I said, oh yeah, right. And I felt like Charlie Brown. The football peak kept being dropped. And then finally, when I thought I'd given up on running, he runs. But I went back over the transcripts with him, and there's some troubling predictions within his words of who he was going to be. When I asked him about Monica and the President Clinton, and his problem with that relationship, he said what he would have done is just take the fifth. Oh, come on, what, a president of the United States is a mobster? Is it accused communist? Just take the fifth?
That seems pretty on brand. Yeah, no, that seems very on brand, very honest in a way,
And he, of course, when I did get him in the ring, I said, what should be done when a woman chooses to have an abortion? He said she needs to be punished. And then, of course, he knew nothing about the pro-life position. He didn't know that it was somewhat contradictory, but he thought it was just sort of plain and simple. If it's killing, you must be punished. So if that's the thinking, I'll go with it. Okay, but that is not the case that pro-lifers present. They blame the doctor, but he was just in my face. He needs to be punished. What do you mean by punishment? I just wonder, what exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, that was the takeaway. I remember that was the headline coming out of that interview that really stuck out, and people were talking about, are we talking about capital punishment? Are we talking about prison? What are we talking about?
We're talking about a fine? I mean, what are we talking about? I don't know. I don't want to get into it, but it's too weird the way he said it.
Yeah, I mean, but that absurdity kind of led into the next few years. We have a question from one of our viewers to talk about another president. Obviously, you have a longstanding relationship and a history with President Jimmy Carter. The question comes from Wayne, one of our viewers, who says, Jimmy Carter has proven to be such a statesman. Several years ago, Time magazine posed the question, is he the best ex-president ever? The question really is, do you agree? And also, what do you think kind of was his major mistake or something that kind of kept him from being reelected? Or was he just a victim of his times where he was all the things that were going on with Iran and other issues?
Yeah. Well, I don't know what, I think the answer to Iran, when we had the 50 diplomats taken hostage, is a difficult one. But the only answer I can come up with, and it's not pro-Carter in any way, you have to have the other country, the mullahs in this case, the revolutionary religious government of Iran, in Tehran, afraid of you, or they'll do it. They were angry, obviously historically angry at us for taking away their democracy in the early 50s. That we knew they had an attitude about us that they'd love to get revenge. We knew all that. So we had to have some counterforce, which would be, you can't mess with the United States. You know, you can't mess with the president. The president will make you pay for it some way. You will pay for this crime. Carter wasn't willing to risk the hostages. I think in many ways he's a pacifist. He still is. He doesn't believe in war. He's a Christian, literally. Thou shalt not kill. I really believe that's him. And I'm not knocking him, but that's not the right person to be president of the United States, probably, because in the end, you have a military like the world's never known, and you have to be willing to at least bluff it, but you certainly have to be willing to use it when it comes to it. I think his gifts were, if he could do it himself, he could do it better than anybody. If it meant going door to door in Iowa or New Hampshire, handing out handbills and getting elected and bringing together Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat, if he could do that himself, he could do it. He did never get a command of the Democratic Party or of the US government. He was never able to get a command of it as an executive. He'd never been an executive. And I think that he suffered from that. And as an ex-president, he could do it all himself. You know, Habitat for Humanity, I went down and covered him in Tijuana, he and Roseland. They're walking around with nail aprons on and carrying 2x4s around. This wasn't a PR stunt. They were actually building houses for poor people. So if he could do it himself, he's really good at it. But then that's an odd kind of critique of a guy I worked for. But I've thought about him a lot. He's a good guy, probably in the wrong position historically. But I don't know what we would have done with another president about double-digit inflation, double-digit interest rates, and then on top of it all, Iran, the three big I's. Inflation, interest rates, and Iran. Reagan might have been able to his credit, when he fired the air traffic controllers, apparently that sent a message to Moscow. I got that from, I think it's in the book, that they said, oh, this guy's a different kettle of fish. This guy's got to be careful about Reagan. He's one to crack a strike, this crooked, and fire everybody. He fired all those public employees. Just they were in Wildcat, gone, you're gone. So sometimes you have to, I remember George W. Bush, Herbert Walker Bush, debated Dan Rather on TV one night, and he beat Rather. He just beat him. He said, remember the time when Rather was trying to hit him on the fact he was in the loop in terms of Iran-Contra, and he said, I think it's wrong to judge a man's career by one incident, like when you walked off the set during that tennis match. I mean, he just remembered this stuff, and he stuck it back, and then he went on and beat Dukakis. But first of all, beating the major network star first, so I think set him up to beat Dukakis. I think you have to show your strength. And Carter wasn't willing to do that. He's not a pugilist. He's not a fighter. He's a good man who found himself in a situation where we needed a nastier man, probably.
Yeah, I mean, when I think of the term civil servant, he's kind of I think exemplifies what that actually is.
He would have been a good head of Department of Transportation. I mean, I'm not like, but Buttigieg is. I wouldn't knock it. Yeah. Because we need people, NASA, like Bill Nelson, the former senator, I just talked to him the other day. We need executives who can do things, but maybe I'm wrong about a big agency, but a small one, I think he would go about, he'd be very deliberative and honest about it. Yeah. He was an honest man. We were all proud of him. We all were.
What do you think, this is kind of obviously speculative, but when you think about the last, I don't know, 50, 60 years, what one presidential election, if it had gone the other way, would have had the most impact, do you think, on the world in the last, half century or so? And let's skip this most recent one, I don't know. I think I'll go back to when I was first, or I wasn't aware of it at the time, but it was during my lifespan. If Dewey had beaten Harry Truman,
the Republican Party of the big Northeast, the establishment party, the New York Herald Tribune, the moderate Republican Party might have blossomed. Instead, it began to die. And the party of the West and the South took over, Goldwater. It just switched to an old Dixie party, basically. And I think the Republican Party might have shifted to that center-right position, establishment position, like the Christian Democrats in Germany, or sort of like the center-right, but not right-wing, or maybe the Tories in Britain. I think that would have been a different political party than it became. But because the establishment lost that election, the party began to shift to the right. And the Birch Society came in, and all the things that Goldwater brought in with him. And I like Goldwater as a kid, but he brought in a sort of people were driving around with Confederate flags. That was the first bad sign for the Republican Party. You don't want the Confederate flag flying in your political debates. You shouldn't be into that.
I mean, talk about the fact you just said you liked Goldwater as a kid. You're so identified now with your what you've written and talked about John F. Kennedy. Obviously, those are very two different people.
Yeah. They were friends, by the way. You know that they were pals. But you're right. I shifted on issues like Vietnam and civil rights, and Goldwater's against civil rights, the bill, and things like Social Security. My dad would argue against the libertarian position and say, you need Social Security because some people don't save any money. So they end up being dependent on the state in their 60s and 70s, 80s. So, there's some practicality that led me to that,
Yeah.
When I think about the Republican Party today, I have no problem not being a part of it.
Yeah, big shock. So I'm curious, you talk about Goldwater. Goldwater is one of those people, it's LBJ too, you hear the stories like when Doris Kearns Goodwin talks about hanging out with him in his later years where his hair has grown long and he's kind of changed. Talk about evolutions. I interviewed George W. Bush just a month ago. And and it was.
What do you say about Iraq, Jeff?
Well, we didn't get into that too much.
Okay.
But we did talk a lot about immigration, and we talked about kind of where he's at on that and his evolution in certain ways. Also, we talked about his view on some of the more January 6th and Donald Trump and some of those issues too. And he's obviously maybe kind of evolved in the public sphere. Are you surprised? Are you surprised with this?
What do you say about Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney? Anything?
That had not happened yet. Liz Cheney's thing had not happened yet when we talked. Like as far as like what her kind of more recent.
Yeah, I don't think he was a big Cheney guy in his second term.
Yeah,
I think Bush thought he had been euchred into that war by Cheney and the neocons, and he definitely wasn't buddy with him in the last 4 years.
Well, that's a question I was going to say was, do you think what we're seeing now, this kind of, it's very controversial. A lot of people would say he's trying to have this public rehabilitation and all this stuff. And some people, obviously he's called a war criminal and many things. But is that more true, do you think, to the person he was pre kind of getting involved with like the Dick Cheneys of the world, like in the early Texas governor years, and he's kind of gone back to that?
I like to think that everybody learns, and everybody eventually gets, the people who voted to quit O.J. Simpson, do they think the same way today? Do they really believe he was innocent, or were they making a case against the behavior historically of the LA police? I think I remember when Liz Cheney was the topic 2-3 weeks ago, and people on the left were dumping all over and saying she was wrong on the war. And my attitude is, well, but she's right now. So give her credit for right now. I mean, trying to judge people in a way that they can win the argument. In other words, if she's stuck with Trump, if she had stuck with Trump, you're going to beat her up. But when she broke from Trump, you're going to beat her up again. You got to give people an outlet and say, let them improve and reward them for it. And I learned that years ago when George Herbert Walker Bush passed a tax increase in 1990, which was going to hurt him politically in 90 in that election that year. And in the 92, it probably cost him the election. I guess Bill Clinton.
Read my lips.
Yeah. And then I wrote, my colleague John Broder said, the newspaper said, well, you can't knock him for not raising taxes and then knock him for raising it. What are you up to here? You got to be honest and fair. And give people a break when they're doing what they think is a civic good.
Yeah.
And no gain in raising taxes. None.
Well, we could talk about that in a moment too. But we have one more question from one of our viewers, Greg, who says, And it's a big question. So, feel free to go, a little bit more diverse on this, but who was your favorite person you ever interviewed? Is there someone that kind of pops out? Maybe that was like someone who was someone who was in the later years and you had a chance to talk to them, or someone
I
who,
think Nelson Mandela,
wow. Yeah.
28 years in prison, refused to leave prison, even though I hadn't seen his wife, hadn't had a life really, 28 years in a cell. And he said, I'm not coming out until my party's is no longer banned, that the ANC can and the Communist Party can all run candidates. And I'm not getting out till we have democracy in this country. And I was gifted with the opportunity to be there when they voted the first time and interviewed him. And I walked around with Archbishop Tutu when he voted, and I saw a line from one horizon to another of voters who believed in democracy. They weren't going to have a war. It wasn't going to be a blood war. The whites were going to lose power because their numbers were so much smaller than the blacks. But we were going to have an honest democracy. And I thought one man did that. He said, we're going to do this democratically. We're going to vote. That's how we're going to get our independence, our majority rule. And I wish he'd been younger, but whose fault is that?
Yeah.
It's the white government that kept him in prison. If they had kept him in prison for 5-10 years, he would have come out a much stronger leader, and he could have led the people. Unfortunately, his successors have not been on his level, unfortunately.
So, Biden, of course, is in his late 70s, and people talk about that a lot. And you've always been great at looking at the field, kind of seeing who's out there now. Who do you think's out there now on that Democratic side that might not be quite on our radar yet, for who you think could be kind of the future of that party? Because I think one of the things that happened with Biden getting elected is it kind of held people back on the bench a little bit. There wasn't this kind of new blood into the system. Who do you
Clearly,
think?
the people that want to be president is a short but obvious list. Buttigieg wants to be president.
Yeah.
Pete Buttigieg. He's going to do his job, keep his mind on the prize, his eye on the prize, but he's not going to stick his neck out. Biden doesn't like that. Biden likes one celebrity in the administration, himself. Kamala knows the same thing. Don't stick your neck out. Don't become too big shot, or you're going to lose any control over yourself. Obviously, Kamala is ambitious as hell, and rightfully so. Look how fast she's moved from district attorney in San Francisco to attorney general in California, United States Senate for California, for life probably. She wanted to stay there. And now vice president, with a president who's probably not going to run for re-election, I think, no matter what he says. I don't think he'll run in his 80s. So that means who's up there in the usual ranks are governors and outstanding senators. Who's ambitious? I think Gavin Newsom from California. I mean, you got to figure.
I mean, he's going to get recalled possibly.
But... he's not getting recalled. Caitlin's not going to beat him. No, he's going to win that one, and probably handily. Yeah. And Caitlyn Jenner. But I don't see anybody for the Northeast. I think Joe Brand wants to run again. I think. I don't see anybody in New England. Joe Kennedy Jr. lost his bid for Senate. He would have definitely run for president. He's out of the picture right now. He could come back in. I don't see anything in the Midwest, anybody in the Midwest. I do think Amy Klobuchar is still ambitious. I'd watch her. She's very likable as a candidate. I've seen her with groups of 200 people. Everybody's attentive as hell to her. She has a way of commanding a small audience, whether she can reach the big national crowds that you sort of have to be able to reach.
She got a little hurt by the fact that her staff doesn't like her, though. She got a little bit hurt by all the reports that no one who works for her actually likes her.
I've heard it all.
Yeah.
And you have heard it all. Shouting heard through the wall, that kind of thing. Yeah. I know everybody well. I'm not going to have a temper, but I think it's very forbidding to run for high office. I think it takes a certain person who has the willingness to, they have to have an ego and an ambition that goes beyond your fear.
Yeah.
Because Bill Clinton didn't do it in 88, but he did it in 92. And he got through it because he just says, we're going to win. When he got in trouble with Monica, he says, we're going to win. And so that force of will maybe comes up in people that grow up in difficult circumstances, without a father. Somebody just says, I can do it no matter what. I will take any kind of heat so I could be president because I have a goal. And, but think about it. The thing about our system is we may have the only system in the world where being a member of a political party means practically nothing. You're not chosen by your peers. People run for the presidency who have nobody else in their corner but themselves. that you find they can't, like, how many senators back Biden? Coons? I
Yeah,
mean, maybe
maybe
Coons. I mean, it's not like in Britain or in Germany or in Israel where a coalition gets together and the cabinet picks you. They're not peer group, they're not peer approved. So they're not chosen as leaders. They just pick themselves. And people say, Biden hadn't run, nobody would have said, I wish Biden had run. If Trump hadn't run, nobody would have said, I wish Trump had run. They pick them, it's self-selection. We don't choose our leaders. We choose among those who select themselves. Usually it gets down to two. That's our job, to pick one of the two ego people that chose to be president of the United States. That's how it works,
Well, I mean, no one without a large ego would think they could run the whole world. So that's, obviously.
Well, that's what it is. How do you go to bed at night thinking about, I'm thinking about Putin, what's he's up to tonight. I'm thinking about Kim Jong-un for North Korea. I'm thinking about him. How about those geniuses in China who've got the long game figured out? And they're working the long game and they're executing it step. Are they going to grab Formosa? Are they going to grab Taiwan? And what do I do if they do? What about Ukraine? What about Georgia? What about the Baltic states? If Putin decides to grab one of them, this KGB officer who's now their leader. I mean, what can we do in the third world? Because China is basically purchasing Africa every day, by giving them infrastructure. And we can't even give ourselves infrastructure. The Chinese come in, they build a railroad. All they want is the underground rights. I mean, they're thinking long haul,
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's not even bringing up the fact that all the domestic issues we have with, with insurrections and white supremacy. Yeah.
And the fact that the next cop killing or cop shooting is on you.
Yeah.
You have to, it's a rugged time.
As we wrap up, a couple of final questions are, Grover Cleveland is the only president, right, that has kind of run, twice in two different elections, and
but he did win that one in the middle.
What's that?
Actually, he won it by 90,000 votes, but he just didn't win the electoral college.
Right. And so, I think the big question, of course, is it going to be 2024? Is the chance that Trump could win again? How do you view that? The guy a little bit. You're good at seeing these things. I think kind of the wheat from the chaff a little bit. And do you see that as a really viable situation?
Well, I think both white men want to run against each other next time. Biden and Trump. And if Biden can beat Trump twice, he's the heavyweight champion. If Trump can come back and beat Biden, he's the heavyweight champion again. DeSantis against Biden, that'll be close because most of the states are already taken. What's left? Maybe you could argue about Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. That's about it. I mean, it really comes down to the short hairs. It's so close. It's razor thin. In this country, it's going to be like that for the rest of our discussions. I mean, I don't see a time when either party gets 60 votes to pass any legislation. I don't see the Democrats get there because there's 21 states, including Oklahoma, which are ruby red. And that means you can't get 60 votes in the Senate. Now, the Republicans might be able to get a surge because they really start pretty strong, but in the electoral college. But I see a country divided and perhaps not really functional for years to come. I see this. I look at Biden's legislative agenda, and I don't see any of it getting through now, because without Manchin and without Sinema and
without killing the filibuster,
and the filibuster sits there being 60 votes, and I think we got to find out what we're doing here. Either Democrats figure out a way to get to these people. I mean, in the old days, you mentioned LBJ, he would find a way to get to Joe Manchin and Sinema, positively or negatively. He would say, "What do you need, young man? What do you need? I can give you what you need." And but Joe has a problem. His state went like 40% margin for Trump, and none of the people on the left, the progressives, would betray their districts if they'd gone that far somewhere. I mean, that's pretty hard to say. Oh, thank you for voting overwhelmingly for Trump. I'm going the opposite of you.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Well, final question is, obviously you're so connected with Tip O'Neill and obviously had that relationship there. If Tip O'Neill was kind of at the helm in 2021, what would those conversations be like about the filibuster and some of those things? Would it be much more behind the scenes, getting stuff done, or would it be more?
I know we had a fight over infrastructure back in '82. And the Republican leader, Bob Michael from Illinois, was trashing the bill on the floor, saying it was a bunch of leaf raking jobs, make work jobs. Pretty good rhetoric. And the speaker went down the floor and listed the names and addresses of the bridges in Bob Michael's district that were below safety code. And he gets red faced, runs to the back of the room. I mean, there are ways. Somebody did that, dug that up for him. Somebody I know very well dug that up for him.
I mean, that kind of political theater can be effective in the moment, and it actually did, work. Did that bill get through?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think, well, we had the majority, but I think you have to change the topic to what does your state need? What is it getting done there? Instead of how many trillions of dollars can we spend on something? Unfortunately, the Democrats, they haven't talked at all about what they're going to do with that trillion plus or 2 or 3 trillion over the next 8 years. You have to show. Trump would talk about rebuilding LAX airport in California, or he'd talk about rebuilding a Penn Station in New York. Or he'd say, maybe you have to draw a picture of why it's done, or show the potholes across the country, or you have to make a case that these have to be done, or we're going to descend into being a third world country. Because the difference between a third world country, the first world country, is you keep your stuff good. You make sure the bridges get fixed. The buildings look good. They're painted every several years. You make it look good. You go to Europe compared to parts of Africa. The fact is some places are so poor, they can't pay anything beyond subsistence payments to people. They just can't, they don't have the money. They don't have the capital. We do. We have the ability to get the money and to build our cities up again. But I worry about what's going on underneath New York City. All those tunnels and wires and sewers and water, and what's keeping that up, and what's keeping the subway going? I mean, that stuff's really, really old.
Yeah.
And we discovered that at 9/11 when we saw the whole seawall coming down. That wall, the below bottom of Manhattan, that's keeping the water out of these buildings. And I don't know what it's like to be a building engineer, a civil engineer today in these big cities, but I think we got to keep it up. That's what a first world country is about.
So what's next? You've got this book. Are there going to be more books? Is there something you haven't tackled yet in the kind of history? Because you have this other kind of side where you are tackling different moments of history. Is there something?
Well, I'm a distinguished professor. It's my title of American politics and media at Ho Chi Minh, Fulbright University, Vietnam, right now. And I'm going to do that part of the year, either by Zoom or over there. Wow. But it's a great irony of history. Vietnam's our friend.
Yeah.
And the kids over there are very smart. I'm going to keep writing. I was a writer, Jeff, before I ever got on TV. And I was
of course.
Hardball, and I wrote Kennedy and Nixon, maybe my best book before I got on TV. And I'm proud of writing. I like being a writer.
Well, I think, I think you should be definitely proud of this book. The book is This Country, My Life in Politics and History. I think it's your best book. I'm glad you wrote it. And it's been a pleasure talking with you, getting to chat for a few minutes. And I hope you will mark that 50th state off your list and come see us.
You know what? I should have never told you that, Jim, but it's something I should get down there and see the place.
We'd love to have you. But thank you all for watching. Thank you, Chris, for joining us, and take care of yourself. Bye-bye.